Well, welcome back there, Golden Bears. Hope you're doing well today and always. Hey, let's go ahead and kick it off. We're in Module 7, Chapter 6 of this, and the transitional 1920s, where we talk about how society is dramatically going to be changing in America as a result of the war, and then ending up with, a lot of problems that America undergoes with regard to those societal changes. Here is a quote from a really famous poet from the Harlem Renaissance during this time period. And we'll talk more about him a little later on. But he says, "We younger Negro artists who create now intend to express our dark-skinned selves without fear or shame. If white people are pleased, we are glad. If they are not, it doesn't matter." And as we unpack what significance the second generation post slavery African-American community has to say, I hope it will speak and resonate powerfully to you. Well, a couple of, a story as usual that I like to share before we dive in, a little bit of my past or a little of something else. But my story goes back to when we had come back from living in Baja for 12 years. And now Baja isn't far from San Diego from where we lived, but our town was rather unique. And I've said this probably a few times if you've been listening or paying attention to some of my videos, that the town we lived in was 1,200 people, and that's counting the horses and the goats and the dogs, okay, literally. And almost everybody knew everybody. It was, I think, 6 by 9 blocks, and the families were all kind of interrelated in how things merged. And literally our neighbor in one side of us, it was a really, really rustic home made out of cinder block. And the ceiling would leak every time it would rain, and she would come over and say, Douglas, queremos prender una lana para lluvia. Can you let me borrow a little tarp to help with the rain? And of course, and so we would pull them out, because I always have a couple of those handy, and fix them up for her, and she was happy as all. I remember one time I had a guest group down of volunteers. I said, "Can we just go knock out and put a new roof on the place for her?" And she was incredibly thankful. Guess what she also did? She had an outhouse, of course, out on the back part of the property, and here we were on our side of the house. On our side of the property, we had 5 air conditioning units on our place. And you say, that sounds kind of crazy. Well, they're called mini splits, and that's just what we used. And our home had the yard and sprinklers, and our TV was satellite. And then literally next door was this gal who roof mostly leaked, who used an outhouse. And when she did laundry, she literally had one of those scrubbing thing made out of cement to do things. And I would look out my window sometimes and see her working diligently. And she literally cooked also out sometimes. If she didn't have enough money to go get the fuel, she would cook over an open flame for a family of 3 or 4 people. And it just was a constant daily reminder of how I should have gratitude, how I should simplify my life. While I would, turn and look into my house, we had a beautiful fireplace. And literally, there's with a big screen TV that had, direct TV. And it was always, for me, a conflict. And of like, why do I have to have so much consumerism? And, this is a challenge for us living down there as to how much and how little and so forth. But when we returned back to the States, it was a challenge. And I tried not to be judgmental, but so many things that we have and we consume that we feel are important that frankly probably aren't. And so I share that with you, is that in this time period in America, it's in transition, is that we have a lot of people who are using consumer goods to derive their meaning and their purpose, and it influences them, and probably not for the best of ways. And so just as my neighbor, she was the salt of the earth, the kindest, most generous person of what she had with us. She didn't have any consumer hang-ups, whereas most of us certainly do. And so I just share that with you as a lingering, ongoing struggle that I have in terms of how I see and reflect on consumer America and how it's driving, but especially when did this all start? And it's during this time period that we see that the consumerism of America was driven here post-World War I. So these are some of the targets that we're going to be looking at, and everything from consumerism to immigrant crises to how to different roles within America are going to be changed and looked at differently. So with that, we start with this culture wars and challenges to social conventions, meaning how is the normal thing done and what is normal, I guess you would have it. And so because of advertising influencing the American mindset, both in newspaper and media that's done on radio, movies that are beginning to come out now, we begin seeing challenges to the normal nuclear family, if we will, or roles of what the male and the female look like, and even, into the roles of different minority groups and what they look like. And so with the film industry out in Los Angeles and in Hollywood, first starting with the silent films of 5 minutes in length, and then going full feature films, and then creating around that a huge advertisement of the new stars, both male and female stars. They were breaking down the social fabric and the social mores of America and influencing not just America but the rest of the world through their clothing that they were bringing out with the flapper movement, to different patterns where actually, a single girl on the movie screen might have kissed another guy. Woo, but these were the opening of the challenges of the social conventions at the time. There were radio shows, one of them Amos and Andy, that kind of continued playing on that, post-Civil War Reconstruction African-American experience that you need to go and, if you want, you can go listen to some of them on the internet. And then we have out in LA a group of fundamentalist Christians that are emerging to kind of say, the Bible is literal. The book of Genesis is literal. The other aspects of the Bible should be viewed literally. And if it says to do this, then you should do this. If it says not to do that, you should follow that. And this really takes hold across middle America and the farmers, and then also in the South. And this will come back a little bit later on at the end of this lecture when we talk about the KKK. Please don't hear me say that the fundamentalists are KKK. It just happens to be that there was some overlapping aspects of their Christian faith that seem to be drawn to that same type of thing. Well, with this new movie generation that your textbook goes through and unpacks a little bit and enough, there also comes a generation called the Lost Generation. And this is maybe how I felt a little bit coming back from Mexico of 12 years. I felt lost. It's like it's described that as an American, you're born, let's say you're born red, okay? And living in Mexico, you're considered blue. But when you come back after living in those countries, in those places for a long period of time, basically Steger came back as purple. I didn't fit in on either side, so to speak. And so that's often what the Lost Generation is. And so the Lost Generation were a group of men and women, authors, and people who were questioning the morality of, what the weapon was, what the war, World War I was about. And for instance, F. Scott Fitzgerald, who some of you are probably familiar with, he wrote The Sides of Paradise, or I'm drawing a blank on the other one, The Great Gatsby. He had a quote that he said, this generation, the post, World War I generation, said they grew up to find all gods dead, all wars fought, and all faith in man shaken. And so these intellectuals really began pressuring and challenging the traditional values as they saw them during that day and time. Here's one example of kind of that influence here of this emerging feminism that was taking place. And yes, although Rudolph Valentino is there as the swinging guy that's wooing the women, here having a single woman in his arms, that was pressing against all sorts of moral values. And so you can imagine how these types of things might have influenced countless young women and young men during this time period. But please let it be known that it wasn't the 1960s that we can look to as the beginning point of the feminist movement. No, no, no. It goes way back to the 1920s, the 1910s and 1920s, with this new emerging role of where in the 1920s in the movies, women were now having cigarettes. They were drinking bourbon. They were dancing as flappers at these nightclubs and expressing themselves. They were having, maybe having relationships during this time that was quite obvious. So these women from the 1920s really set the tone and ushered in more of a feminist movement than what many maybe likened to the 1960s. And we'll get to the 1960s here in a few months. So the second part that is major changes taking place here in post-World War II and post basically the Great Depression, okay, is this thing called the Harlem Renaissance and the rise of black nationalism. So with the Great Migration that I talked about in the last lecture and people moving into the major cities to the north and some moving west, they brought with them their cultural heritage. And with the tune of, let's say, 120,000 of them living in the Harlem region of New York, they began recognizing, wait a minute, why do we have to minimize the value of our culture? Why can't we begin expressing ourselves and expressing with pride and dignity? And so this group of people began paying homage to themselves called the New Negro, meaning that we weren't born slaves. We're the second generation since slavery has happened. And you know what? Maybe we want to talk certain ways. We want to express ourselves certain ways. We have music that we want to express certain ways. The way we eat, the way we act, the way we talk and dress, etc. And so this group of people were rather unique, both in Chicago and in New York, and they inspired other African Americans to join in with their movement. Okay, so it's the Harlem Renaissance. You've probably heard of their jazz musicians, etc. that you can follow. You can listen to them to this day. But one such, I'm drawing a blank off the top of my head as to the famous trumpeter like Louis Armstrong and others that you could hearken back to listen to of their music. This I'll talk about during the Steger Select. Well, continuing on, there's another group of a man that emerges from Jamaica, and he comes to Harlem as well. And he, unlike Booker T. Washington, and unlike W.B. Du Bois, he has a different idea. He says, I'm tired of having our Negro movements having to work within the establishment. Why can't we start our own challenge to these institutions? And so he basically began gaining support for this Back to Africa movement that essentially he bought a large cruise ship, and his goal was to begin repatriating thousands of African Americans who were willing to leave America and go back to Ghana or go back to a new area they called Liberia that they had created, and to repatriate these Africans. What was their goal? Is to then use these educated, empowered, and funded people by America to begin challenging the imperialistic countries that had taken over most of Africa at this time. That was his strategy. And for the most part, he had some followers and adherents, but what's interesting is that Garvey flat out disagreed with Du Bois and his plan, or Booker T. Washington, and they weren't enemies, but he was certainly a hardcore critic of what he had done. So here you see him in his military garb, kind of basically conveying what he wanted his adherents to go do there if they made it to Africa. Regrettably, he was found guilty of, what was it called? Not racketeering, but breaking the mail fraud, I guess it was. And because of that, he had to serve 2 years in prison. And then after he got out of prison, because he was from Jamaica and not a naturalized citizen, they deported him, where eventually his movement basically came to a dead stop. Well, let's talk then about prohibition, fundamentalism, and modern American life. You can recognize it. A lot of change going on. That's why it's called in this lecture, it's Transition, America in Transition. So we have a group of fundamental Christian women, these progressives, if you will, that if you remember in the last lecture, we talked about the 19th Amendment and how they were able to come together and get the right to vote. But they were also working on transforming what they thought were the bad things of their generation, and that was alcohol. And they namely focused on different immigrant groups who they thought were the ones kind of passing this along. And so they get the 18th Amendment passed with the manufacture and sale of alcohol, and then they convinced the government to pass the Volstead Act, which essentially set up agencies that can go and enforce this amendment. And what did this eventually do? By within a 10 years window of time, they noticed that it didn't decrease the alcohol consumption, but it did increase the crime that was taking place. And so most Americans welcomed back the rescinding of this prohibition and get back to, finding a balanced approach. But what you do need to note is that this 18th Amendment was geared towards really like an extension or an ideology against the immigrants, as they were bad for America. So speaking, of this, I'm not going to spend a lot of time of the trial of the century, but because of this growing fundamentalism that was happening in LA, and this fundamentalism that then influenced Middle America, namely, Indiana's, the Iowas, etc., and also down the South, there was these fundamentalists felt Charles Darwin's theory of evolution was a major attack on the Christian ideology system. And so there was this Scopes trial that many now have determined that it was basically a publicity stunt for a small town in Tennessee to hold, in Dayton, there it is, to kind of gain weight to bring people from all over the globe, and basically all over America for sure, namely, all the reporters and the photographers and the lawyers and the teams of lawyers to come. What did that do? It filled their restaurants, filled their hotels, and everybody got to do that. But there were two key people that came in: Clarence Darrow, a famous and antagonistic lawyer who doesn't believe in God, and then William Jennings Bryan. He was our Secretary of State for some time. He ran for president 3 times, and he's there defending the Protestant faith. Ultimately, what boiled down to is nothing came of this trial. Basically, will science be taught in school? Yes, it wasn't ultimately decided to get rid of it. And so trial of the century really wasn't that, but it was just a means to use media to express the fundamentalist idea that they're under attack. And if we don't push back against these liberal ideas that are being espoused, then America will be taken over and won't ever turn back. Well, we have then also issues with immigration. And you would think that America, post the World War I and the factories growing and expanding and people buying, and there's not enough workers for the most part, that they would be happy to have immigrants coming in. But no, during this time you see a continued restriction and a continued attack on various immigrant groups coming in. And so one of them is that they continue to focus on the Asians and not allowing them. In fact, we had a treaty with Japan that unequivocally said, if you want American products, you have to make sure, Japanese emperor, you keep your Japanese people away from here in America. They also passed laws about declaring that certain, if you're coming over from English-speaking areas or other areas, that you had to be able to read in your native language or write in your native language. We also didn't want epileptics or feeble-minded persons. We would call that Down syndrome. We didn't want physically defective people or professional beggars. Basically, Congress passed these laws in 1917 to say we don't want undesirables and those that aren't bringing things with a value to that. And so what this creates is this idea of nativism, this continued anti-immigrant expression that has been part of American history, if you've hopefully been listening over the past 3 time periods. And it just is this threat to the big cities and the cultural values and everything that you see there. And it's a rather sad and unfair situation for most of them. The pinnacle of that I think expresses this American anti-immigrant sentiment. And so just as I love to talk about case studies, the Sacco and Vanzetti case is a perfect example of what you need to be aware of and mindful of when we're talking about America's distaste for immigrants at this time. Well, there was a robbery in some small random town outside of Boston by these two alleged Italians, where 2 employees were murdered. And Sacco and Vanzetti were determined the immigrants to ones who were charged with the crime. And even though there was no link and no evidence of these two, they were simply kind of radical anarchists who were calling for different communistic type of things, and they just seemed like the most likely thing. As the trial revolved around their anarchist beliefs, instead of the facts surrounding if they actually killed someone or not. I mean, there was an instance where the judge even called them, the Italian Dagos, really derogatory term for that. So there was really no degree of fairness. When the verdict was given that they would be sentenced to death, there was a public outcry, not only across America, but across the globe. Different countries email or telegraphing this, saying, can we get a trial in a different area where you might not have Bostonian people upset about all of these alleged agitators, or upset at all of these, immigrants that are there? It's basically pure, racism. And so sentenced not by peers, but sentenced by people who didn't like, the immigrants. So the verdict happened. They were eventually executed by 1927. And this is a famous court case that you need to look at to recognize the kind of the underbelly ugliness of America and our inability to, on one hand, where we're supposed to welcome the immigrants, but most of the time treat them with this degree of disdain. During this same time, the National Origins Act passes, and this develops a quota system that still influences America immigration to this day. So basically it said that if you have already 12% of America, based on, in this time, the 1890 census, 12% of America has Irish immigrants here, then we only allow 12% of new, or percentage of 12% of immigrants coming from Ireland into America for the subsequent year. So it kind of puts together some sort of mathematical formula to do that. However, because America was against the Chinese coming in, that made it very difficult for them to come in by just hundreds of them a year, all with the exception of Mexico and the Western Hemisphere. Why? Because we frankly needed more and more food created, and they were the ones that are willing to come and work on the ranches. And this is kind of the double standard that America has. Now, you need to recognize that during this time that we continue, again, we're not taking care of the African American experience, and we are certainly not taking care of the Native American experience. In fact, prior to World War I and during it specifically, we cut funding for those Indians living on their reservations, to where children were dying, they were having tuberculosis outbreaks, and it was a horrific thing. And it wasn't until well past the end of the war that finally they get a right to vote and have equal access to vote, but it doesn't say anything about health and giving them greater degree of assistance in that. So as we come close, we need to recognize that immigration and America's track record on that is just horrible and atrocious, and we continue to pick out different people groups simply because they might sound, talk, or look different from us. But ultimately, most of the Americans who were here as second-generation Americans, I'm namely speaking whites, fear them because they might take their jobs, fear them because they're going to bring in new thoughts and actions to America, and namely this thing called the Red Scare that is coming over from Russia. And then the last thing that we want to talk about is this ugliness of the resurrection of the Ku Klux Klan. And if you remember, the KKK was strong prior to the Civil War, and then post-Civil War during the Reconstruction time, President Johnson worked really hard to try and dismantle it, while at the same time encouraging them to run for political office. So by the time 1877 hit, we had a lot of Ku Klux Klan members there in various government positions. Well, the government began cracking down on them in the late 1880s because they saw them as kind of a violent group that spoke up and out against some of the values that was American going for. Well, here they now have a resurgence again. And it's not necessarily a resurgence of against African Americans, although they still are on their target list. They're now broadening their target at the people who they don't like, the Catholics, the Jews, the immigrants, and anybody who supports the teaching of evolution. And they also do this under the cloak of under God and the banner of God and fundamentalist Christianity as to why they needed to defend this. And they used horrific terror tactics and got involved with politics and did a lot of dirty politicking in order to find themselves in power and to create legacies of ugly change across the landscape of America. Okay, what eventually brought about their fall is that one of their grand masters out of Indiana was accused of raping one of his younger girl that was on a committee, and he was found guilty of this crime, which was a surprise. But basically, he thought he would get pardoned by the governor, and when the governor didn't pardon him for this crime, he then spilled all the beans about every person in government offices there in Indiana and other places that had taken bribes, and judges had taken bribes, etc. What did this do? Here the KKK was running under a Christian organization where they're trying to, create an essence of truth and dignity. And then here they were finding out that one of their key leaders was doing horrific things, raping and killing that girl, and then all the corruption that was in place. So in a way that brought about the fall of KKK, and we'll see them emerge again a little bit later on, but their strength it grew, and then it constricted back again to this. The last thing that we want to talk about is this election. You can see on this map here that if in 1910 we would have seen more of a popular vote, and if you remember the map of 1896, you would have seen on the far left it looking, and then the far right, so the West Coast and the East Coast having a certain look versus in the middle. Now you see the South versus the rest of it. That is kind of sticking strong. And then you have up in number 13 in Wisconsin, Mr. Robert La Follette and the Progressives gaining a little bit of traction up there. So what does this say about America? Has the pendulum swung back the other direction? Yes, it's fair to say that America has swung back again toward the Republicans and their policies of looking away and allowing the wealthy industrialists to kind of have their call across the America and the influence during this time. So the end result that we see of this is that we see the fading of American prosperity. We're going to begin seeing problems erupting because of the Great Depression that will happening, and you'll have Herbert Hoover, who's not going to be really equipped and capable of meeting those needs, even though he seemed to have potential as a candidate. Remember, he was involved in World War I, helping collect food and help keep track of how America was being part of the war effort. But we just see that the bee sting, that's the famous thing about political parties, is they fly around and buzz around, but once they sting you, that means the bee dies, right? That's the case here in this situation, is that whole lot of flying of bees going around, but ultimately the Democrats and the Republicans lasted, and the bee sting struck, and only one landed. So ultimately, progressivism didn't influence at the macro level by getting a president elected, but what it did do is it really survived on the local and state levels, that we'll begin seeing how this will come into play at a greater place as we unfold and get further down the line with FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, becoming president and addressing these problems of the Great Depression. But we're not quite there yet. That's in a few more chapters. So don't be too considered with that. So in conclusion, I started with the story of me living in Mexico and the consumerism and the sadness that this created. This consumerism has continued in America, and it has influenced how youth movements, culture, the lost generation has emerged from that. It influenced how African Americans started the new movement there in Harlem Renaissance, And then this conservative showed up where they began infiltrating the politics and demanding fundamentalist Christianity. They then began demanding alcohol being repealed. They have the Ku Klux Klan, and we have this idea of nativism and how these conservatives feel that the immigrants are bad for America and challenge their thing. So on that, keep it classy, Golden Bears. Miss ya, and we'll be seeing you next time.